The afternoon sun slanted through the tall, dusty windows of the old rehearsal hall on South Wabash, casting long golden rectangles across the scuffed wooden floor. Outside, Chicago hummed. Buses rumbled, distant sirens wailed, and the wind off Lake Michigan carried the sharp bite of early spring. Inside, the air felt thick, heavy with tension and the faint lingering scent of rosin and old sheet music. Auditions for the Chicago Youth Symphony's summer intensive program were winding down, and the energy in the room had shifted from eager anticipation to polite exhaustion. Dozens of young musicians had already come and gone that day. Most arrived in crisp button-down shirts or modest dresses, portfolios clutched tightly to their chests, fingers nervously tapping out silent scales on their thighs. They played with precision, flawless runs, clean articulation, dynamics carefully measured like ingredients in a recipe. Each performance was technically impressive, polished to a high sheen through years of private lessons, summer camps, and parental investment. The casting panel, 3 adults seated behind a long folding table, nodded along, making neat check marks on their forms, occasionally exchanging quiet murmurs. They weren't unkind, just efficient. This was a competitive program after all. Only 12 spots. Standards had to be maintained. Then the door creaked open again. He stepped inside like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. Not timid exactly, but cautious, as if testing the air. He was tall for his age, maybe 17, with shoulders that seemed to carry more than just the weight of his thin frame. His coat was oversized, clearly second-hand, the cuffs frayed and one button missing. His sneakers were worn down at the heel, the laces knotted unevenly. In one hand he held a small, battered notebook, its cover stained with what looked like coffee or ink, and nothing else. No sheet music folder, no instrument case. Just him and that notebook. A few of the remaining auditioners glanced up from their phones or their sheet music. One boy, tuning his violin with exaggerated care, nudged his friend and smirked. Another girl whispered something behind her hand, her eyes flicking toward the newcomer like he'd wandered in from the wrong building. The casting director, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun, barely looked up from her clipboard. Her name was Miriam Voss, though no one in the room dared call her that. To them, she was just the director, a figure known for her exacting standards and zero tolerance for unpreparedness. She'd been with the symphony for over 2 decades, and her reputation preceded her. If you weren't serious, you didn't last 5 minutes in her presence. She finally glanced his way, her expression unreadable. "Name?" she asked, pen poised. He cleared his throat. "Leo," he said, voice low but steady. "Last name?" "Martinez." She scanned her list, brow furrowing slightly. "You're the last one. We're running behind." There was no warmth in her tone, just fact. "I know," he said. "Sorry," she didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the grand piano in the center of the room, a gleaming black Steinway that looked wildly out of place in the otherwise modest space. "You're auditioning on piano?" "Yes. Do you have your prepared piece?" she asked, already flipping to a new page on her clipboard. He hesitated. "I do. Sheet music?" No, that got her attention. She looked up fully now, eyes sharp. "No sheet music? Do you have it memorized?" "Not exactly," he said. "It's something I wrote." A beat of silence. Then from the corner a soft snort. The violinist, tall, confident, with perfectly gelled hair, shook his head and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Oh, great." Another street performer thinking this is open mic night. A few others chuckled. It wasn't malicious, not really. Just the kind of casual dismissal that comes from feeling secure in your own place. They'd spent years in conservatories, flown to competitions, practiced under the watchful eyes of world-class instructors. This kid, with his thrift store coat and ink-stained fingers, didn't look like he belonged in the same universe, let alone the same audition room. Miriam's expression didn't change, but her pen stilled. "You composed your own piece?" she asked, voice flat. "Yes." "For piano?" "Yes." She exhaled slowly through her nose, glancing at her watch. "We don't typically accept original compositions unless they've been pre-approved." The guidelines were clear. "I read them," Leo said. "But I didn't have anything else ready. This is what I've been working on." Another pause. The room felt tighter now, the air charged. The other kids watched, some with pity, most with mild amusement. Miriam studied him, not his clothes, not his posture, but his eyes. There was something there she couldn't quite place. Not arrogance, not desperation, something quieter, Something stubborn. 2 minutes, she said finally, her voice clipped. That's all I can give you. If it's not compelling by then, I'll stop you. He nodded. Thank you. He walked to the piano, his steps quiet on the hardwood. He didn't rush, didn't fidget. Just approached the instrument like it was an old friend he hadn't seen in a while. He sat on the bench, adjusted it, too high, and slid it back an inch. Then he placed his hands on his knees and took a breath. Not a dramatic inhale, just a slow, grounding one, like he was centering himself. The room waited. He lifted his hands. They were slender, calloused in places, nails bitten short. He hovered over the keys for a moment, fingers trembling slightly. Not from nerves, but from something deeper, something worn thin. Then he played. The first note was soft, barely there. A single C in the middle register, held just long enough to hang in the air like a question. Then another note joined it, E-flat, creating a minor chord that felt both sad and strangely comforting. The melody that followed was simple at first, almost childlike in its phrasing, but layered with a complexity that crept in slowly, like fog rolling over a lake. It wasn't flashy. No thunderous arpeggios or lightning-fast runs. Instead, it unfolded like a story being whispered late at night. The violinist stopped tuning. The girl with the flute lowered her phone. Even Miriam, who had begun writing something on her clipboard, paused mid-stroke. Because something was happening. Leo's fingers moved with a kind of quiet urgency. He wasn't just playing notes, he was shaping them, bending time around them. A phrase would start gently, then swell with emotion before receding again like waves against a shore. There were moments of dissonance, clashing notes that shouldn't have worked, but somehow they resolved into something achingly beautiful. It sounded like loneliness, like hope stitched together from scraps, like the hum of a laundromat at 2 a.m., or the distant wail of a train cutting through a sleepless city. No one moved. The smirk was long gone from the violinist's face. He stood frozen, bow dangling from his fingers. The girl who'd whispered earlier now had her hand over her mouth, eyes wide. Even the panel members, 2 of whom had been quietly chatting, had gone still, their pens forgotten. Leo didn't look up. He kept his gaze on the keys, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm only he could hear. His coat sleeve rode up a little, revealing a faded band t-shirt underneath and a thin silver chain around his wrist. Maybe a gift, maybe a keepsake. His breathing was steady, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the bench between phrases. The piece built slowly, not toward a climax, but toward a kind of quiet revelation. A repeating motif emerged, a 4-note sequence that felt like a heartbeat or a memory trying to surface. It echoed through different registers, sometimes mournful, sometimes defiant. At one point, he used the sustain pedal in a way that made the notes blur together like watercolors on wet paper, creating a haze of sound that wrapped around the room. And then, just as the 2-minute mark approached, he began to wind it down. The chords grew softer, sparser. The final notes were single, deliberate, each one given space to breathe, to resonate. The last one hung in the air for a long moment before fading into silence. He lowered his hands to his lap. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of what had just happened. Full of disbelief, awe, and something harder to name. Even the usual ambient sounds of the building, the hum of the HVAC, the distant clatter of a janitor's cart seemed to hold their breath. Miriam stared at him. Her clipboard lay forgotten on the table. Her usual composure, the tight-lipped professionalism, the air of detached authority, had cracked. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something sharper. Recognition. She cleared her throat, twice. What? She began, then stopped, swallowed, tried again. What is that piece called? Leo looked down at his hands, then back up at her. His voice was quiet but clear. Laundromat Nocturne. She didn't say anything for a long time. Just studied him, the frayed cuffs, the ink stains, the quiet certainty in his eyes. Then so softly that only those closest could hear, she said, "Play it again." And just like that, the room, once filled with judgment, impatience, and the quiet arrogance of assumed superiority, became something else entirely. It became a space where something real had happened. Something human, something that couldn't be measured in technique or training, but in truth. Outside, the city kept moving. Buses rumbled. Wind howled. But inside that rehearsal hall, time had bent around a boy, a piano and a melody born not in a conservatory, but in the quiet corners of a life most people never see. And for the first time that day, no one was thinking about who belonged. They were just listening. Long before the polished floors of that audition room, long before the skeptical glances and the hushed silence that followed his playing, there was a different kind of quiet, the kind that settles in small apartments late at night when the rest of the city has gone to sleep. That's where his music really began, not in concert halls or classrooms, but in the hum of dryers, the creak of floorboards, and the soft sighs of someone working too hard for too little. He lived on the third floor of a brick building on the south side, the kind of place where the elevator hadn't worked in years, and the hallway lights flickered like they were debating whether to stay on. The apartment itself was small, 2 rooms, a kitchenette that smelled faintly of bleach and burnt toast, and a bathroom with a shower that only gave hot water if you sang to it just right. His mother worked at a laundromat 3 blocks away, the kind with linoleum floors and plastic chairs bolted to the ground. She started her shift at 6 a.m. and often didn't get home until after midnight, her hands raw from detergent and her shoulders permanently hunched from folding other people's clothes. He never complained. Not out loud anyway. He made his own breakfast, usually oatmeal with a spoonful of sugar, and walked to school with his backpack slung low, earbuds in, listening to recordings of Chopin, Bill Evans, or sometimes just the rain. Music wasn't a hobby for him. It was a lifeline, a way to make sense of a world that didn't always make sense back. His first piano wasn't even his. It was a beat-up upright someone had left on the curb outside a church one winter. The keys were yellowed, a few of them stuck, and the middle C had a wobble that made it sound like it was laughing at you. But it worked. Mostly. He'd dragged it home with help from a neighbor, a retired mechanic with a bad knee and a soft spot for kids who tried too hard. They hauled it up the stairs piece by piece, swearing the whole way, and reassembled it in the corner of the living room. His mother didn't say much when she saw it, just shook her head and muttered, "We don't have room for that," but she never asked him to get rid of it. Maybe because she saw the way his eyes lit up when he sat in front of it. Maybe because she remembered a time long ago when she used to hum lullabies while folding laundry, before life got too heavy to sing. He taught himself. No teacher, no lessons, no fancy method books, just YouTube videos on a cracked phone screen. The volume turned low so it wouldn't wake his mom. He'd watch a clip of a Rachmaninoff prelude over and over, pausing every few seconds to mimic the fingering on his own keyboard. Sometimes the video would buffer, and he'd sit there in the dark, hands hovering over the keys waiting for the music to return. Other times the Wi-Fi would cut out entirely, and he'd just play what he remembered, filling in the gaps with his own ideas. That's how Laundromat Nocturne started. Not as a composition, but as a patchwork of memory and invention, stitched together during nights when sleep wouldn't come. He wrote in that notebook constantly. Not just notes or chords, but feelings. A phrase that sounded like the way his chest tightened when he saw his mom's tired eyes. A rhythm that matched the clatter of coins dropping into the washing machine. A harmony that echoed the loneliness of walking home alone under streetlights. He didn't think of it as art, it was just how he breathed. School wasn't easy. He wasn't bad at it, he got decent grades, kept to himself, but he never quite fit in. The other kids talked about vacations, new sneakers, weekend plans at the mall. He stayed quiet. Not because he was shy, but because his world felt too different to explain. Once in music class, the teacher asked everyone to name their favorite composer. Most said Beethoven or Mozart. He said Thelonious Monk. The room went quiet. The teacher smiled politely and moved on. After class, a boy cornered him by the lockers. "Who's that?" he asked. "Some rapper?" Leo just shook his head and walked away. It wasn't worth the effort to explain. But there was one person who listened. Mrs. Delgado, his neighbor across the hall, a woman in her 80s with silver hair always pinned in a neat bun, and a voice that sounded like warm honey. She'd been a singer once back in Puerto Rico, before moving to Chicago with her husband who'd worked on the railroads. He'd passed years ago and now she lived alone. Her apartment filled with framed photos, the scent of cinnamon, and an old radio that played boleros all day long. She'd heard him playing through the walls. Not the loud, showy pieces, but the quiet ones, the ones he thought no one else could hear. One evening, she knocked on his door holding a plate of arroz con pollo. "You play like someone who's seen too much," she said, handing him the plate. "But your hands still believe in beauty." He didn't know what to say, so he just thanked her. She came by often after that, sometimes with food, sometimes just to sit and listen. She never gave advice, just presence. And once, when he was struggling with a passage that wouldn't come together, she said, "Music doesn't care how clean your shoes are. It only cares if your soul's tuned." Those words stuck with him, more than any technique tip or theory lesson ever could. As he got older, the piano became more than an escape. It became a responsibility. He knew his mom was counting on him to graduate, to get a job, to maybe one day not have to choose between bus fare and dinner. But he also knew, deep in his bones, that if he stopped playing, something inside him would break. So he found ways to keep going. He took odd jobs, stocking shelves, walking dogs, helping neighbors carry groceries, just to keep the electricity on so he could practice at night. He skipped lunch sometimes to save bus fare for library trips, where he'd read books on music theory and scribble ideas in the margins. He never asked for help, not because he was proud, but because he didn't want to be a burden. When he heard about the Youth Symphony's summer program, it wasn't the prestige that caught his attention. It was the fine print. Selected participants receive full access to conservatory facilities, mentorship, and performance opportunities at no cost. No cost. Those two words shimmered like a promise. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where music wasn't just something he did in secret, but something he could build a life around. He spent weeks preparing, not by learning a standard piece, but by refining his own. He wanted to show them not what he'd been taught, but what he'd lived. The night before the audition, the laundromat's main pipe burst. Water flooded the back room, soaking bags of clean clothes and shorting out the dryers. His mom called him in tears. He ran over, rolled up his sleeves, and spent the next 6 hours mopping, hauling wet laundry, and helping her reset the machines. They didn't get home until 3 a.m. He barely slept. But when morning came, he put on his best coat, the one with the missing button, and walked to the audition hall with his notebook in hand, his fingers stiff from cold and exhaustion. He didn't expect to impress anyone. He just wanted to be heard. And now, sitting in that room, watching the casting director's expression shift from skepticism to something unreadable, he realized something. It wasn't about whether they accepted him. It was about whether they understood, whether they could hear past the frayed cuffs and the lack of sheet music and listen to what the music was really saying. Because his story wasn't in the notes alone. It was in the spaces between them, the silence after a chord fades, the breath before a new phrase begins. It was in the way his left hand sometimes lagged just a fraction behind his right, not from lack of skill, but from carrying something heavier than rhythm. It was in the slight imperfections, the wobble in a sustained note, the uneven touch on a soft passage, that made it human. Back home, the apartment was empty when he returned. His mom had already left for her double shift. He dropped his notebook on the kitchen table and sat at the piano. He didn't play Laundromat Nocturne. Instead, he played a simple scale, slowly letting each note ring out. Then another. Then a chord, just to feel the keys under his fingers again. To remind himself that this quiet communion with sound was real no matter what happened next. Outside, the city buzzed on, indifferent. But inside that small apartment, music lived, not as a performance, not as a competition, but as a quiet act of survival. And maybe, just maybe, as the first note of something new. The morning of the audition had started like any other. Gray light filtering through thin curtains, the distant groan of a garbage truck, the smell of yesterday's coffee still clinging to the air. He'd woken before his alarm, his body already humming with a low current of nerves he couldn't quite name. Not fear, exactly. More like the quiet tension before a storm breaks. He'd reheated last night's rice, eaten it standing over the sink, and double-checked the notebook in his bag. The pages were dog-eared, smudged with pencil marks and coffee rings, but the music was clear in his head. It always was. He walked to the audition hall with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. The city moved around him, people rushing to work, students laughing on their way to school, delivery bikes weaving through traffic. But he felt separate from it all, like he was watching through glass. His mind kept circling back to one thought. What if they don't hear it? Not the notes, not the technique, but the truth underneath. The part that couldn't be written down. When he stepped into the rehearsal space, the air changed. It wasn't just the polished floors or the expensive piano. It was the energy. The other kids carried themselves differently. They stood taller, spoke with easy confidence, adjusted their cuffs like they'd done it 1,000 times before. He felt like he'd walked into a room where everyone spoke a language he hadn't been taught. And maybe he had. But he had his own language too, one built from late nights, secondhand pianos, and the sound of his mother humming while folding someone else's shirts. Still, when the casting director looked up and asked for his sheet music, and he said he didn't have any, the room shifted. It wasn't loud. No one shouted or pointed. But the glances, the half-smiles, the way one boy rolled his eyes like it was all a waste of time, that stung more than he expected. He'd faced skepticism before, sure. Teachers who assumed he wasn't serious because he didn't own a metronome. Kids who laughed when he said he'd never taken a lesson. But this felt different. This was the gate, and the gatekeeper looked like she'd already decided he didn't belong. He almost walked out, not because he was embarrassed, though his face burned, but because it felt pointless. Why play for people who'd already made up their minds? But then he remembered Mrs. Delgado's words. Music doesn't care how clean your shoes are. And he remembered his mother's hands, red and cracked from detergent, still folding, still working, still believing in him even when she was too tired to say it out loud. So he stayed. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, took that breath, the one that grounded him, that reminded him this wasn't about them. It was about the music, about telling the story only he could tell, and then he played. He didn't think about the panel, didn't watch their faces. He closed his eyes and let his fingers find their way, like they always did when the world got too loud. The first notes came out softer than he'd planned, almost hesitant, but that was okay. Hesitation was part of the truth, too. Life wasn't all bold declarations. Sometimes it was whispering in the dark, hoping someone was listening. As the piece unfolded, something strange happened. The room didn't just get quiet, it changed. The air thickened like the sound had weight, like it was pressing against the walls. He could feel it even with his eyes closed. The mocking glances were gone. The smirks had vanished. Even the rustle of papers stopped. All that remained was the piano, his hands, and the story they were telling together. He played the part where the left hand mimicked the rhythm of a washing machine, steady, relentless, a little off-kilter. Then the right hand answered with a melody that rose above it, fragile but determined, like hope pushing through concrete. He let the dissonance hang where it needed to, didn't rush to resolve it because sometimes pain doesn't have a neat ending. And when the main theme returned, the four-note phrase that felt like a heartbeat, he played it slower this time, heavier, like it had been through something. He didn't notice when the 2 minutes passed. Didn't hear the director's pen stop scratching. Didn't see the violinist lower his bow or the flutist clutch her instrument like it might disappear. He was too deep in the music, too wrapped up in the memory of sitting at that broken piano in his living room, playing for no one but the walls and the ghost of his father's old cassette tapes. When he finally lifted his hands, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had just been said without words. And for the first time all day, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt seen. Then the casting director spoke. Her voice was different now, softer, slower, like she was choosing each word carefully. What is that piece called? He opened his eyes, looked at her, really looked. And for the first time he saw not just authority, but curiosity, maybe even wonder. Laundromat Nocturne, he said. She didn't respond right away. Just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then so quietly it was almost a whisper. Play it again. He blinked. Again? She nodded. From the beginning. He glanced around. The other auditioners were frozen, their earlier amusement replaced by something closer to awe. The violinist looked like he'd been slapped. The girl with the flute had tears in her eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all waiting. He turned back to the piano, placed his hands on the keys, and played. This time he played it slower, more deliberately. Let the silences breathe longer, let the dissonance ache a little more, because now he knew they were listening, not just hearing but listening. And that changed everything. Halfway through he noticed the casting director had closed her eyes. Her shoulders, usually rigid, had relaxed. One of the other panel members, a man with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard, leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, chin resting on his clasped hands. The room wasn't judging anymore. It was receiving. When he finished the second time, the silence lasted even longer. Then finally the casting director opened her eyes. She didn't applaud, didn't smile, but she nodded, once slow and serious, like she'd just witnessed something sacred. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She asked. "I didn't," he said honestly. "I just figured it out." She studied him for a long moment. "No teacher? No lessons?" "No." "And this piece, did you write it all yourself?" "Yes." She exhaled, long and slow, like she was letting go of something she'd been holding on to too tightly. "Most kids your age come in here trying to impress us with how fast they can play, or how many octaves they can reach. You came in here and told us a story." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. She looked down at her clipboard, then back up at him. "We don't usually accept original compositions. The program is structured around classical repertoire. But," she paused, choosing her words, "but sometimes the most important music isn't the kind that's been played 1,000 times. It's the kind that's never been heard before." He felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly. More like the first breath after holding it too long. One of the other panel members spoke up then, a woman with warm brown eyes and silver hoops in her ears. "That motif, the 4-note phrase, it reminded me of Gershwin, but with a completely different soul." "Where did that come from?" He thought for a moment. "It's the sound of the train that goes by my window every night at 2:17 a.m. I used to lie awake listening to it when I couldn't sleep. One night I tried to play it on the piano. It didn't sound right at first, so I changed it. Added a note. Took one away. Until it felt like home," the woman smiled. "That's not just composition. That's memory turned into melody." The casting director leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Do you know what a nocturne is?" He nodded. "It's a night piece. Usually quiet, reflective." "Exactly," she said. "And yours? It's not just about a laundromat, is it?" He shook his head. "No, it's about the people who work there. The ones who keep going even when no one's watching." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Come back tomorrow, same time. We'd like to hear more." He didn't ask what that meant. Didn't need to. He just stood, thanked them quietly, and walked out. Outside, the city was the same, buses, wind, distant sirens, but he felt different. Lighter. Not because he'd been accepted, he still didn't know if he would be, but because for the first time someone had heard him. Really heard him. Not the kid in the thrift store coat. Not the boy with no formal training, but the person behind the music. He walked home slowly, hands in his pockets, the afternoon sun warm on his face. When he got to his building, Mrs. Delgado was sitting on the front steps peeling an orange. "Well?" she asked, holding out a segment. He took it. "They asked me to come back tomorrow." She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I knew they would. How?" "Because you didn't play for them," she said, peeling another segment. "You played it through them. There's a difference." He sat down beside her on the steps, the orange sweet and bright on his tongue. For a while they just sat in silence, watching the neighborhood go by. A kid on a bike, a dog barking behind a fence, the smell of someone cooking beans drifting from an open window. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow. Didn't know if this was the beginning of something big or just a brief moment of being seen. But for now, in this quiet afternoon with his neighbor and the taste of orange on his lips, he felt enough. And sometimes that was the most important note of all. The next morning came with a different kind of light, softer, golden, like the city itself was holding its breath. He woke before dawn, not because his alarm went off, but because his body wouldn't stay still. His fingers kept twitching against the sheets, replaying phrases in the dark as if the piano were still under them. He made coffee, weak because they were running low, and sat at the kitchen table flipping through his notebook. The pages felt heavier now, charged with something he couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or the quiet weight of being seen. He didn't tell his mother what had happened the day before. Not because he was hiding it, but because she'd left for her shift before he woke. A note taped to the fridge. Leftovers in pot. "Don't forget your jacket." He smiled faintly. She never asked about auditions or music or dreams that didn't pay bills, but she always made sure he had a jacket. He walked to the rehearsal hall again. Same route, same coat, but everything felt different. The air didn't press against him like it used to. The stares from strangers didn't feel like judgment. They just felt like people living their own lives, unaware of the quiet storm inside him. When he pushed open the heavy door to the audition room, he expected it to be empty, just like yesterday. But it wasn't. The casting director was already there, seated at the same table, but this time she wasn't holding a clipboard. She looked up when he entered, and instead of the tight-lipped professionalism from before, there was something else in her eyes. Curiosity, yes, but also respect. The other two panel members were there too, sipping from paper cups, their expressions open, expectant. "Good morning," she said, her voice warmer than he remembered. "Morning," he replied, stepping inside. "You didn't have to come back," she said. "But I'm glad you did." He nodded, not sure what to say. He wasn't here to perform again, not exactly. He was here because they'd asked, and because something in him needed to know if yesterday had been real, or just a fluke of tired ears and dim lighting. She gestured to the piano. "Sit whenever you're ready." He walked over, sat, adjusted the bench, still too high, and placed his hands on his knees. This time there was no audience of skeptical peers. No smirks, no whispers. Just three adults who'd chosen to stay to listen again. That alone made his chest tighten. "Play whatever you'd like," she said. "It doesn't have to be the same piece." He thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. "I'd like to play it again. Laundromat Nocturne?" "Yes," she smiled slightly. "All right." He took a breath, deeper this time, and began, but this wasn't a repeat. It was a conversation. The first time he'd played to be heard. This time he played to connect. He leaned into the silences more, let the harmonies linger, allowed the dissonance to ache just a little longer before resolving. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't proving anything. He was simply sharing a part of himself that had no other language. Halfway through, he noticed the woman with the silver hoops had closed her eyes. The man with the beard was nodding almost imperceptibly, as if the music were confirming something he'd long suspected about the world. And the casting director, she wasn't taking notes. She was just listening, her hands folded on the table, her expression soft in a way that made him think she too had once been told she didn't belong. When he finished, no one spoke for a full minute. Not out of politeness, but because the music hadn't fully left the room yet. It was still hanging in the air, vibrating in the walls, settling into their bones. Then the casting director leaned forward. "Tell me about your father." He froze. Not because it was a strange question, but because no one ever asked. His father wasn't a topic in their house. Not out of anger, but out of silence, the kind that grows when something is too painful to name. "He left when I was 8, he said quietly. "Didn't say goodbye. Just gone." She nodded. "But you have his piano?" He shook his head. "No, that one's from a church dumpster." "Then where did your love for music come from?" He hesitated. "He left a cassette tape, just one, full of jazz standards, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, some old Billie Holiday. I found it in a drawer when I was 10. Played it on this busted Walkman until the tape started to fray." She was quiet for a moment. "So you never heard him play?" "No, but I heard what he loved, and that was enough." She looked at him like she was seeing layers she hadn't noticed before. "Music is how you stay close to him." He didn't answer. But the silence said yes. The man with the beard spoke then. "Most composers your age write to impress. You write to remember. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. And it hit him harder than any praise ever could." The casting director leaned back. "We've been doing this program for 23 years. We've heard thousands of auditions. Perfect technique. Flawless execution. But rarely do we hear something that feels true." She paused, then added, "You didn't just play a piece. You invited us into your life." He looked down at his hands. They were still trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of being understood. "We'd like to offer you a place in the summer intensive," she said. "Full scholarship. Access to practice rooms, mentorship, performance opportunities. All of it." He blinked. "Really?" "Yes," she said. "But more than that, we'd like you to keep writing. Keep playing your own music. The program is built around classical repertoire, but we think it's time we made space for voices like yours." He didn't cry, not then. But something inside him cracked open just a little, letting in light he didn't know was waiting. They talked for another hour, about his influences, his process, the way he heard rhythm in everyday sounds. They asked about his notebook, his late-night practice sessions, the neighbors who listened through the walls. It wasn't an interrogation. It was a conversation between people who finally spoke the same language. When he left, the sun was high, casting sharp shadows on the sidewalk. He didn't rush home. He walked slowly, absorbing the moment, letting it settle. He passed a busker on the corner playing a saxophone, the notes raw and joyful. He dropped a few coins in the open case and stood for a minute just listening. Back at his building, Mrs. Delgado was watering her window boxes, humming a bolero under her breath. She looked up when he approached. "Well?" she asked, setting down the watering can. "They accepted me," he said. She didn't cheer, didn't clap. She just nodded like she'd known all along. "Of course they did. Why do you say that?" "Because you weren't trying to be anyone else," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You just showed up as yourself. And sometimes that's the rarest thing of all," he smiled. "They want me to keep writing my own music." "Good," she said. "The world has enough copies. It needs originals." That night after his mother came home, exhausted, her hair damp with sweat, her shoes scuffed from another double shift, he told her. Not in a grand way. Just over a bowl of reheated beans and rice, the TV murmuring in the background. "I got into that music program," he said quietly. She looked up from her plate. "The one with the auditions?" Yeah, she studied him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Her skin was rough, her grip strong. "I knew you would," she said. He was surprised. "You did?" She nodded. "I've heard you play, mijo. Every night. Through the walls. You don't just play notes, you play everything." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just squeezed her hand back. Later, after she'd gone to bed, he sat at the piano. He didn't play Laundromat Nocturne. Instead, he started something new. A melody that felt like gratitude, like relief, like the first quiet morning after a long storm. It didn't have a name yet, but it didn't need one, because for the first time he wasn't playing for survival. He was playing for possibility, and that changed everything. The summer that followed didn't unfold like a movie. There were no sudden spotlights, no viral videos, no crowds chanting his name. Instead, it settled in quietly, like morning light through a window, steady and sure. He showed up to the conservatory every day, usually before anyone else, his notebook tucked under his arm and his thrift store coat still hanging off his shoulders. At first, some of the other students watched him from a distance, unsure what to make of the kid who'd walked in with no sheet music and walked out with a full scholarship. But that curiosity didn't last long. Not once they heard him play. He wasn't there to outshine anyone. He was there to learn, and learn he did, not just about scales and sonatas, but about listening. The program paired him with a composer in residence, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd written symphonies performed in Europe, but still took the bus to work and carried his lunch in a paper bag. They met twice a week in a sunlit practice room overlooking the courtyard, and instead of correcting him, the man asked questions. "Why that chord? What are you trying to say here? Does this passage feel like truth or like imitation?" It was the first time anyone had treated his music like it had something to teach them, not just something to fix. He kept writing, not for approval, not for applause, but because the music kept coming, sometimes in bursts, sometimes in whispers. He wrote a piece inspired by the sound of rain on the fire escape outside his window, another based on the rhythm of his mother's footsteps coming home late at night. He even started experimenting with blending classical structures with the gospel harmonies he remembered from church as a child, the blues licks he'd picked up from old records, the syncopated beats of the city itself. His music didn't fit neatly into any category, and that was exactly the point. When the symphony announced its end-of-summer showcase, the casting director, now just Miriam to him, asked if he'd be willing to perform, not as a student recital but as part of the main program. On the same stage as the senior ensemble, in front of a full house, he hesitated. "Are you sure?" She looked at him over her glasses. "I've spent 23 years listening to technically perfect performances that left me cold. Yours was the first one in years that made me feel something. That's not just talent. That's rare." So he said yes. The night of the concert, the theater buzzed with the usual pre-show energy, parents adjusting ties, students tuning instruments, ushers handing out programs. He sat backstage, not in a dressing room, but on a folding chair near the wings, his hands resting on his knees. He wasn't nervous, not really, just present. He'd played for laundromats and leaky apartments and neighbors who listened through thin walls. A concert hall was just another room with ears. When his name was called, he walked out alone. No introduction, no fanfare. Just him and the piano under a single spotlight. The audience quieted as he sat. Some recognized him from the audition rumors, the kid who played his own piece, but most had no idea what to expect. He played Laundromat Nocturne. But this time, it was different. Not because the notes had changed, but because he had. The piece was fuller now, more assured, yet still tender in all the right places. He let the opening notes hang in the air like questions, then answered them with a melody that rose like smoke from a quiet fire. The dissonance still ached, but now it resolved with a kind of grace that only comes from having lived through it. When he reached the train whistle motif, the 4-note heartbeat, he played it softer than ever, like a secret past between old friends. Halfway through, he saw Miriam in the front row. She wasn't taking notes. She wasn't judging. She was just listening, her eyes closed, a single tear tracing a slow path down her cheek. And in the third row, he spotted the violinist from the audition, the one who'd smirked. Now sitting perfectly still, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable until the very end, when he stood. Not out of obligation, but because he couldn't stay seated. When the last note faded, the silence lasted longer than any applause ever could. Then slowly people began to rise, not all at once but one by one, like waves building. The girl with the flute was crying openly. An older man in the back wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Even the stagehands, usually invisible in the shadows, paused their work to watch. He didn't bow dramatically, just nodded, stood, and walked off stage. No grand exit, no encore. Just the quiet dignity of someone who'd said what he needed to say. After the concert, people wanted to talk. To him, about him, around him. A local journalist asked for an interview. A music school in another state sent an email expressing interest. But he turned most of it down, not out of pride, but because he knew what mattered. The music wasn't meant to be packaged or promoted. It was meant to be lived. Back home, life didn't change overnight. His mother still worked double shifts. The elevator in their building still didn't work. But something had shifted between them. A quiet understanding, a shared pride that didn't need words. One evening, as they ate dinner, she said, "I heard you on the radio." He looked up, surprised. "The concert was broadcast?" She nodded. "I was folding towels at the laundromat and someone had it playing on their phone. I stopped working, just listened." He didn't know what to say, so he reached across the table and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. Mrs. Delgado threw him a small celebration the next week. Just the three of them in her apartment, with a rose con pollo and a store-bought cake that said, "Bravo." In wobbly icing, she played old boleros on her radio and told stories about singing in San Juan when she was young. "You remind me of myself," she said, pouring him a glass of horchata. "Not because you're loud, but because you carry your truth quietly like a lantern." He smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you. You did it yourself," she said firmly. "I just reminded you that your light was worth sharing." As the months passed, something unexpected happened. Not fame, not fortune, but ripples. A music teacher in a nearby high school started encouraging students to write their own pieces, not just copy the masters. A busker downtown began incorporating original compositions into his sets. And at the next youth symphony auditions, 2 kids showed up with their own music, nervous, unsure, but willing to try. When one of them was met with skepticism, a voice from the waiting area said, "Remember Leo." And the room grew a little kinder. He never sought the spotlight. He kept practicing in his apartment, now with a slightly less broken piano, donated anonymously by someone who'd heard the broadcast. He kept writing, kept listening to the city, kept turning everyday sounds into music that felt like home. He applied to a few colleges, not for the name on the diploma, but for the practice rooms and the libraries and the chance to keep learning. Years later, long after the summer program had ended, Miriam would tell new students a story. Not about technique or discipline, but about a boy who walked in with ink-stained fingers and a notebook full of truth, and reminded them all why they fell in love with music in the first place. "It's not about how clean your shoes are," she'd say, echoing words she'd once heard from an old neighbor. "It's about whether your soul's tuned." And in a small apartment on the south side, a young girl, maybe 10, maybe 11, sat at a second-hand keyboard, trying to mimic a melody she'd heard on the radio. Her mother watched from the doorway, tired but smiling, and whispered, "Keep going." Someone's listening, because that's how it spreads. Not in headlines or hashtags, but in quiet rooms, in second chances, in the courage to sit down when everyone expects you to walk away. And sometimes all it takes is one person playing their truth to remind the rest of us that music, and humanity, thrives not in perfection, but in the beautiful, messy spaces in between.